The living room was a mess of tangled Christmas lights and scattered ornaments. John Thompson, a 72-year-old veteran with silver hair and weathered hands, stood in the middle of the chaos, his brow furrowed in confusion. He held a string of lights, trying to remember where they were supposed to go. The twinkling bulbs reflected in his pale blue eyes, but the spark of recognition was missing. Sarah's voice echoed through the house as she entered, shaking snow from her coat. The smell of pine needles mixed with the aroma of freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. She called out for her dad, her voice tinged with concern. She found John in the living room, still holding the lights, his gaze fixed on the half-decorated Christmas tree. Sarah's heart sank as she noticed the ornaments scattered on the floor, some broken. It was clear her father had been struggling with the decorations for hours. Sarah approached him softly, offering her help. John turned to her, a flicker of relief crossing his face. He seemed surprised by her presence, struggling to articulate his difficulty with the decorations. Sarah gently took the lights from him, guiding her father to sit in his favorite armchair. As Sarah worked on the lights, her mind wandered to Christmases past. She remembered her father, strong and confident, lifting her to place the star on top of the tree. Now he sat quietly, watching her with a mix of gratitude and bewilderment. The dementia had been creeping in for years, but this holiday season seemed to have brought a sharp decline. John's forgetfulness had turned into long periods of confusion. He'd get lost in his own home, forget to eat, and sometimes struggle to recognize family members. It broke Sarah's heart to see her once vibrant father reduced to this state. While arranging ornaments on the tree, Sarah noticed a box she didn't recognize tucked away in the corner. Curiosity piqued. She set down the baubles and reached for it. The cardboard was worn, with military stuff scrawled across the side in her father's handwriting. Sarah inquired about the box, bringing it over to John. He squinted at it, then shrugged, unable to recall its contents. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing a treasure trove of memories. Military medals clinked together as she rummaged through the box. At the bottom, she found a stack of photographs. As she flipped through them, her breath caught in her throat. There, in faded color, was her father. Younger, stronger, standing proudly in his uniform. But what caught Sarah's eye was the large German shepherd sitting obediently at John's side. Photo after photo showed John and the dog together, in the barracks, on training grounds, and even one of them wearing Santa hats in what looked like a military mess hall decked out for Christmas. Sarah softly asked her father about the dog in the photo. John leaned forward, squinting at the image. For a moment, his face was blank. Then, slowly, a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He reached out, gently touching the dog's image with a trembling finger. In a voice barely above a whisper, John identified the dog as Ranger. The name seemed to unlock something in John. He didn't say anything more, but his eyes remained fixed on the photo, the smile lingering on his face. Sarah's mind raced. She'd heard her father mention a dog named Ranger before, in his more lucid moments, but she'd never seen these photos. Clearly, this animal had been an important part of her father's life. As John continued to gaze at the photo, Sarah made a decision. She'd find out what happened to Ranger. Maybe, just maybe, reconnecting with his old companion could help her father. The next day, while John napped, Sarah began her search. She started by calling her father's old military contacts, explaining the situation. Most of the calls led to dead ends. But finally, she got a promising lead. A gruff voice on the other end of the line remembered Ranger, describing him as one of the best dogs they ever had. The contact promised to make a few calls and get back to Sarah. Hours later, Sarah's phone rang. The news was better than she could have hoped. Ranger was alive, retired from service due to age, and currently residing in a shelter for former military dogs just a few hours away. Without hesitation, Sarah made arrangements to visit the shelter. She told her father she had some Christmas shopping to do, not wanting to get his hopes up in case things didn't work out. The shelter was a simple, well-maintained facility on the outskirts of a nearby town. As Sarah walked through the kennels, her heart raced. What if Ranger didn't remember her father? What if he was too old or ill to come home with her? Then she saw him. In a kennel near the end of the row sat a large German shepherd. His muzzle was gray, and he moved slowly as he stood to greet her, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. The shelter worker introduced Ranger, explaining that he'd been with them for about a year. Despite being a great dog, his age made adoption unlikely. Sarah knelt down, letting Ranger sniff her hand through the kennel door. She spoke softly to him, introducing herself as John's daughter and asking if he remembered John. At the mention of John's name, Ranger's ears perked up. He let out a soft whine and wagged his tail. That was all Sarah needed to see. After filling out the necessary paperwork and getting approval for the adoption, she loaded Ranger into her car. The old dog settled into the back seat, his eyes never leaving Sarah as she drove. Sarah reassured Ranger as they drove home, her voice filled with hope for a Christmas miracle. 2 days before Christmas, Sarah brought Ranger home. She'd prepared John as best she could, telling him she had a surprise for him. But as they stood in the living room, John just looked confused. John's bewilderment was evident as he asked Sarah what was going on, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Sarah gently explained that she had someone who wanted to see him. She opened the front door, and Ranger walked in. The old German shepherd moved slowly but purposefully. His nose twitched as he took in the sense of the house. Then his gaze locked onto John. For a long moment, nothing happened. John stared at Ranger, his brow furrowed in confusion. Ranger stared back, his tail giving a tentative wag. Sarah softly prompted her father, asking if he remembered who the dog was. John shook his head slowly, admitting his uncertainty. Sarah's heart sank, but she forced a smile. She introduced Ranger, explaining his connection to John's military past and that she had brought him home for Christmas. John nodded absently, but it was clear the name meant nothing to him. He shuffled over to his armchair and sat down heavily, his gaze drifting to the window. Ranger, however, seemed to remember. The old dog padded over to John's chair and sat down next to it, looking up at the man he had once known so well. As the day wore on, John remained in his chair, lost in his own world. But Ranger never left his side. When John got up to use the bathroom, Ranger followed, waiting patiently outside the door. When John moved to the kitchen for a glass of water, Ranger was right behind him, gently nudging him back to the living room when he started to wander towards the basement door instead. Sarah watched all of this with a mixture of hope and heartache. Her father might not remember Ranger, but the dog clearly remembered him. As night fell and she prepared dinner, she could hear Ranger's nails clicking on the hardwood floor, following John's shuffling footsteps throughout the house. Maybe, she thought, just maybe this old bond could be rekindled. As she set the table for dinner, Sarah allowed herself to hope that this Christmas might bring a miracle after all. Ranger's unwavering attention to John was just the beginning. The real journey of reconnection was about to unfold, one small moment at a time. As the evening settled in, Sarah finished setting the table for dinner. The warm glow of Christmas lights filled the living room, casting a soft radiance on John and Ranger. The old dog hadn't left John's side, his eyes constantly fixed on the veteran's face as if trying to will recognition into existence. Sarah called her father to the table, and Ranger immediately stood, gently nudging John's hand with his nose. John looked down, momentarily startled, then slowly rose from his chair. As he made his way to the dining room, Ranger stayed close, matching his pace to John's shuffling steps. During dinner, Ranger lay at John's feet, his tail occasionally thumping against the floor. John absent-mindedly dropped a piece of turkey, and Ranger carefully took it, his movements slow and deliberate, as if not to startle the man he once knew so well. After the meal, as Sarah cleared the table, John started to wander towards the front door. His face was a mask of confusion, eyes darting around the unfamiliar yet familiar surroundings of his own home. Before Sarah could intervene, Ranger was there, gently pressing against John's leg, steering him back towards the living room and his favorite chair. That night, as Sarah helped her father prepare for bed, Ranger followed them upstairs. When John was settled, the old dog curled up on the rug beside the bed, his eyes never leaving John's face. Sarah patted Ranger's head, whispering a quiet thank you before turning out the light. The next morning, Sarah awoke to the sound of movement downstairs. Fear gripped her heart. Had her father wandered off in the night? She rushed down to find John in the kitchen, attempting to make coffee. Ranger sat nearby, watching intently. The counter was a mess of spilled grounds and water, but John seemed determined in his task. Sarah gently took over, guiding her father to sit at the kitchen table while she prepared breakfast. As they ate, she noticed John's eyes frequently drifting to Ranger, a hint of curiosity in his gaze. The dog remained close, his head resting on John's knee. Later that morning, as Sarah hung the last of the Christmas decorations, John picked up one of Ranger's old photos from the military box. He studied it intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Ranger, sensing something important, padded over and placed his head on John's lap. For a moment, John's hand hovered uncertainly, then slowly came to rest on Ranger's head. Sarah held her breath, hoping for a spark of recognition, but John simply continued to stare at the photo. Still, it was the longest he'd focused on anything in weeks. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed small changes in her father's behavior. He seemed more present, his gaze clearer. When it was time for his medication, John didn't resist, as he often did. Instead, he obediently took the pills when Sarah brought them, Ranger watching approvingly from his side. In the afternoon, Sarah suggested a walk to see the neighborhood Christmas lights. John nodded, and as they prepared to leave, Ranger stood by the door, tail wagging expectantly. Sarah clipped on his leash, and they set out into the crisp winter air. The sidewalks were slick with freshly fallen snow, and John's steps were uncertain, but Ranger walked steadily beside him, providing a solid presence to lean against when needed. As they passed houses decked in twinkling lights and festive decorations, John's eyes widened with childlike wonder. Halfway through their walk, John began to tire, his steps becoming more labored. Sarah was about to suggest they turn back when Ranger took charge. The old dog gently tugged on his leash, guiding them down a different street, a shortcut home that John himself used to take. Sarah marveled at Ranger's memory and instinct. Even after all these years, the dog remembered the quickest way to get John home safely. As they walked, she noticed her father leaning slightly on Ranger, his hand occasionally brushing the dog's fur as if for reassurance. Back at the house, the warmth enveloped them as they shed their winter layers. John settled into his chair, cheeks ruddy from the cold, a contentment on his face that Sarah hadn't seen in months. Ranger curled up at his feet, ever vigilant. As evening approached, the doorbell rang. Sarah's brother, Mike, had arrived with his wife and 2 children for Christmas Eve dinner. The house soon filled with the chaotic energy of family, laughter, and excited chatter about Santa's imminent arrival. John watched the scene unfold from his chair, his eyes tracking the movement but his expression uncertain. The noise and activity seemed to overwhelm him, his hands gripping the armrests tightly. Sensing his distress, Ranger pressed closer, resting his head on John's knee. The effect was almost immediate. John's grip loosened, his breathing slowed, and he began to relax. During dinner, the family shared stories and memories of past Christmases. Mike recounted tales of their father's elaborate Christmas morning scavenger hunts, his voice thick with emotion. John listened, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth, though it was unclear if he truly remembered or simply enjoyed the warmth of his family's presence. After the meal, as the adults cleared the table and the children played with their new toys, John wandered back to the living room. He stood before the Christmas tree, gazing at the twinkling lights. Ranger, as always, was by his side. Sarah watched from the doorway as her father reached out, gently touching one of the ornaments, an old wooden soldier that he had carved himself decades ago. His fingers traced the familiar shape, and for a moment Sarah saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. Suddenly, John turned to Ranger, his hand outstretched. "Here, boy," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. Ranger's tail wagged furiously as he pressed his nose into John's palm. Sarah's heart leaped. It was the first time since Ranger's arrival that John had directly acknowledged the dog. She held her breath, hoping for more, but John simply patted Ranger's head and turned back to the tree. As the evening wore on, the family gathered in the living room to watch a classic Christmas movie. John sat in his chair, Ranger at his feet, while the others arranged themselves on the couch and floor. The soft glow of the TV illuminated their faces, the familiar story washing over them. Halfway through the film, Sarah glanced over at her father. To her amazement, she saw tears glistening in his eyes. On screen, a scene played out of a soldier returning home for Christmas. John's hand had found its way to Ranger's head, gently stroking the soft fur. When the movie ended, Mike's children clamored to open one gift each, as was their Christmas Eve tradition. As wrapping paper flew and excited squeals filled the air, Sarah noticed her father watching intently. His eyes followed the children's movements, a smile tugging at his lips. In a moment of inspiration, Sarah retrieved a small, hastily wrapped package from under the tree. She approached her father, holding out the gift. "This is for you, Dad," she said softly. John looked at the package, confusion clouding his features. With gentle encouragement from Sarah, he slowly unwrapped it. Inside was a new collar for Ranger, embroidered with the dog's name and a small American flag. John ran his fingers over the stitching, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, to everyone's surprise, he leaned down and carefully fastened the collar around Ranger's neck. The old dog sat patiently, his tail thumping against the floor in steady rhythm. As John straightened up, his eyes met Ranger's. For a long moment they gazed at each other, man and dog, present and past intertwining. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, John spoke. "Good boy, Ranger." The room fell silent. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. It wasn't a full recovery, not by far, but it was something. A small crack in the wall of confusion that had surrounded her father for so long. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the arrival of Christmas Day, the family gathered around the tree for a final moment together. John remained in his chair, but he seemed more present than he had in months. His eyes, once vacant, now held a spark of awareness as they moved from face to face. Ranger lay at John's feet, his body pressed against the old man's legs. Every so often, John's hand would drop to scratch behind the dog's ears, the movement so natural it seemed almost unconscious. Sarah watched her father, hope blossoming in her chest. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. Dementia was a cruel, unrelenting foe. But in this moment, on this Christmas morning, she allowed herself to believe in miracles. As the family began to disperse, heading off to bed with whispered, "Merry Christmas," and warm hugs, John remained in his chair, gazing at the twinkling lights of the tree. Ranger stayed faithfully by his side, a silent guardian. Sarah lingered, watching her father and the dog who had once been his closest companion. In the soft glow of the Christmas lights, she saw John's hand move to rest on Ranger's head. The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. No words were exchanged, no grand gestures made. But in that quiet moment, as Christmas Day dawned and the world outside lay hushed under a blanket of snow, Sarah witnessed the power of an unbreakable bond. A bond that had transcended time, distance, and even the fog of a fading mind. In that moment, Sarah understood. Ranger might not have brought back all of her father's memories, but he had brought back something just as precious. A sense of peace, of belonging, of home. As she climbed the stairs, her heart full of gratitude and hope, Sarah smiled to herself. This Christmas had indeed brought a miracle. Not one of instant healing or sudden remembrance, but of reconnection, of a love that endured beyond words or memories. And as the first light of Christmas morning began to peek through the windows, John Thompson slept peacefully in his chair, his loyal friend Ranger at his feet, both of them home at last. Have you ever faced a similar situation with a loved one suffering from dementia? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. If you were touched by John's journey and Ranger's unwavering support, please give this video a like. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. Your support means the world to us.